Chapter 1: The Arrival at Hollow Creek. The mist hung low over Hollow Creek as investigative journalist Ethan Carter arrived, drawn by chilling reports of mysterious disappearances. The town had long been abandoned, yet an unnatural stillness hung in the air, as if the land itself had been frozen in time. As Ethan parked his car at the entrance, he took in the eerie surroundings: rotting wooden fences, crumbling houses with shattered windows, and a road that seemed to disappear into the fog. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the damp gravel. Before him stood a moss-covered sign, its faded letters barely legible: Hollow Creek, once a place of hope. He had read stories of entire families vanishing overnight, their belongings left untouched, their meals still set on dining tables. The locals from neighboring towns spoke of Hollow Creek in hushed tones, their faces dark with. Ethan pulled his camera from his bag, capturing the abandoned street before him. The wind carried an eerie whistle through the broken structures, rattling loose shutters. The deeper he walked into Hollow Creek, the stronger the sense of being watched became. But by whom? There were no footprints in the mud, no signs of life. The further he ventured, the more the air thickened with unease. The silence was oppressive, almost as if the town was waiting for him to step further, waiting for him to listen. And then, as the fog curled around him like ghostly tendrils, he heard it. A whisper. Chapter 2: The Vanishing Townsfolk. As Ethan ventured deeper into Hollow Creek, the unease in his chest grew heavier. The streets, once alive with the hum of daily life, now stood frozen in time. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the creaking of a loose shutter or the rustling of leaves carried by the wind. But there were no voices, no distant chatter, no human presence at all. He passed by a row of homes, peering through the broken windows. Inside, plates of half-eaten meals sat on dinner tables, the food now rotting. A child's toy lay abandoned in the doorway of one house, as though dropped mid-pay. Clothes hung on laundry lines, stiff with dust, as if their owners had simply walked away, never to return. A sudden gust of wind pushed a wooden rocking chair on a porch, making it sway back and forth. The movement sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It looked as though someone had just left it. But there was no one. He made his way to the town's records office, hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. The wooden door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing shelves lined with dusty books and scattered papers. A desk sat in the center of the room, covered in handwritten notes and ledgers. He flipped through them, scanning for anything useful, and then he found it: a large, tattered ledger labeled Town Registry. His fingers trembled as he turned the brittle pages. The names of the townsfolk were listed in careful handwriting, but as he read further, he noticed something chilling. Each name had been crossed out with deep, erratic strokes, as if in desperation. Next to every name, a single word had been scrawled. Take. Ethan's pulse quickened. What did it mean? Who had taken them? And why was there no record of where they had gone? As he stared at the list, the air around him grew heavy, the dim light flickering. A whisper drifted through the room, soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind. You shouldn't be here. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Fog. The deeper Ethan ventured into Hollow Creek, the more unnatural it felt. The thickening fog curled around him like ghostly fingers, reducing visibility to mere feet. The further he walked, the heavier the air became, pressing against his chest with an oppressive weight. Hollow Creek was no ordinary ghost town. It was alive in a way that defied explanation. Then he heard it. Whispers drifting through the mist. At first, they were too faint to comprehend, like voices carried from a distance. But as he strained to listen, the words grew clearer. "Leave before it's too late." He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The fog swirled in response, shifting like a living thing, but there was no one there. His pulse quickened. The town was abandoned, wasn't it? The whispers didn't stop. They moved around him, their voices layered, overlapping, growing in intensity. They weren't the scattered ramblings of the wind. They were deliberate, urgent, a warning. Ethan reached for his camera, trying to capture something, anything, that could explain what he was experiencing. As he lifted the lens to his eye, a shape flickered in the mist. A dark figure, standing motionless just beyond his reach. He froze. "Who's there?" he called out. No response. The figure remained still, its silhouette shifting within the fog, like it was dissolving and reforming at the same time. He could feel its gaze on him, an unseen presence assessing his every move. The whispers continued, a symphony of unseen voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand, punctuated by the occasional desperate plea. "Run!" Ethan took a step back, every instinct screaming at him to listen, to flee while he still could. But he needed answers. Swallowing his fear, he stepped forward, his flashlight slicing through the fog. The beam hit empty space where the figure had been. Then, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. It carried a finality that sent a deep, primal fear through him. Something had changed. Something had noticed him. And whatever it was no longer warning him. It was waiting. Chapter 4. The Cursed Cabin. At the heart of Hollow Creek stood a weathered, rotting cabin, its wooden beams twisted with age. The windows were shattered, the shutters barely hanging onto rusted hinges. Deep scratches marred the door, as if something had clawed at it, desperate to get inside or escape. Ethan hesitated before stepping onto the creaking porch, his breath visible in the cold air. The interior of the cabin was suffocatingly dark, dust and decay thick in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he cautiously moved forward, his flashlight beam revealing disarray. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and pages of journals scattered across the floor. He knelt down, picking up one of the journals, its leather cover cracked and faded. The ink was smudged in places, but the frantic handwriting was still legible. "The curse is real. The shadows come at night. They take us one by one. If you are reading this, run." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. The author of these words had been here, in this very room, desperately trying to warn whoever came next. He flipped through the pages, the entries growing more frantic. The last one was barely readable, the ink smeared by what looked like blood. I hear them. They know I'm here. The door won't hold much longer. If you find this, it means I didn't make it. They whisper my name. I see them in the corners of my eyes, but when I turn, they're gone. Don't let them see you. Don't let them. The sentence ended abruptly, the pen stroke trailing off into nothingness. A chill crawled down Ethan's spine. He flipped the journal shut and reached for another when suddenly, the cabin creaked. A low groan, almost like breathing. The temperature plummeted. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. Then, in the silence, a single whisper slithered through the darkness. You stayed too long. The door slammed shut behind him. Chapter 5. The Unmarked Graves. Behind the cabin, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing filled with unmarked graves, their crude wooden crosses standing in eerie silence. The sheer number of graves sent a shiver down his spine. How many people had been buried here? How recently? The ground looked strangely disturbed, the dirt too loose, as if something or someone had been recently buried. Yet, Hollow Creek had been abandoned for years. Ethan knelt down, running his fingers through the soil, feeling a cold dampness that didn't match the arid surroundings. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting the dead. His eyes landed on a gravestone different from the others. Unlike the simple wooden crosses, this one was a smooth slab of dark stone, untouched by time. There was no name carved into it, only a single word. Taken. Ethan's breath hitched. He had seen that word before, in the town's registry. Was this where the missing townsfolk had ended up? If so, who had buried them? A gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying a whisper that sent chills down his spine. He turned sharply, scanning the dense tree line. The forest around him stood unnaturally still, the trees rigid, as if listening. Then the ground beneath him shifted. He scrambled back as the soil at the nearest grave began to sink. A hand, pale, skeletal, emerged, clawing its way to the surface. Ethan stumbled, his pulse hammering. Another grave shifted, then another. More hands broke through the earth, reaching, grasping. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him. The air turned ice cold. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, watching in horror as the ground convulsed. A voice, clear and guttural, rose above the others, seeping from the graves themselves. We were taken, and now so are you. Chapter 6. The River of No Return. The town's river ran black under the moonlight, its surface eerily still, almost as if frozen in time. Ethan stood at its edge, peering into the inky darkness, trying to discern its depths. The water had once been sacred, according to the town's folklore, believed to grant protection and purity, but now it reeked of decay, a foul stench rising with the mist that curled above its surface. A glimmer of movement beneath the water made Ethan step back, his breath hitching. The ripples did not move outward as they should, but rather pulled inward, as if something beneath the surface was breathing, inhaling. The river was alive, but not in a way that nature intended. He lifted his flashlight, directing the beam across the water. At first, there was nothing but the sickly reflection of light on the unnatural blackness. Then, movement. A shape slithered just below the surface. Something elongated and disturbingly fluid, its form impossible to define. Ethan's fingers tightened around his flashlight. He reached into his bag, retrieving a small stone, and tossed it into the river. The moment it broke the surface, the water recoiled as if in pain, ripples spreading outward violently, before vanishing entirely, the surface returning to an unnatural calm. And then he heard it, a whisper, not from the air, but from the river itself, a chorus of voices, speaking in unison, their words distorted, garbled, yet chillingly clear. "Come closer." Ethan took an involuntary step back, his pulse racing. The river wasn't just cursed, it was hungry. He turned to leave, but then he saw them. Faces, pale, ghostly visages just beneath the surface, their hollow eyes fixed upon him. Their mouths opened, moving soundlessly in the water, their hands reaching upward. The lost ones, the taken. The river held its prisoners, their souls bound to its depths, waiting, watching. Ethan knew if he lingered too long, he too would join them. As the whispers grew louder, more insistent, he forced himself to move. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. But as he hurried away, the last words from the river stayed with him, chilling him to his core. "We never leave, and neither will you." Chapter 7. The Church of Hollow Eyes. The only structure still standing tall was an old church at the end of the main street, its spire reaching toward the sky like a skeletal finger. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, were now dulled by dust and neglect. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, the musty scent of old wood and damp stone filling his lungs. No one had lived in Hollow Creek for decades, so who had lit the candles? His fingers tightened around his flashlight as he stepped inside, boots echoing against the cracked marble floor. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he froze. The pews were not empty. Dozens of figures sat in rigid silence, their heads bowed as if in prayer. They wore dark, tattered robes, hoods drawn low over their faces. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, a waiting presence that sent ice crawling down Ethan's spine. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Hello?" His voice barely broke the heavy silence. No one responded. Slowly, he reached out and tugged at the sleeve of one figure. The moment his fingers made contact, the robe collapsed inward, crumpling onto the pew. There was no body inside, just empty cloth, folded as though an invisible presence had simply ceased to exist. A breath of cold air rushed past him, and the candles flickered wildly. The robed figures began to shift, one by one, falling in on themselves, collapsing into empty husks. A whisper rose from nowhere. "You have disturbed the sermon." Ethan turned sharply, his heart pounding. The altar, once covered in dust, was now pristine, and standing behind it was a figure draped in ceremonial robes, its face obscured by the deep shadow of its hood. The church groaned as the temperature plummeted. Kneel or be taken. The whisper was no longer just a sound. It was a command. Chapter 8. The Shadows Beneath the Town. Following the clues, Ethan uncovered a trapdoor hidden beneath the church's altar. The old wood groaned as he pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A musty, stagnant air rose from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like rust or dried blood. His flashlight flickered as he stepped down, the stone walls closing in around him. The deeper he ventured, the colder the air became, a biting chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. His breath fogged in front of him as he moved forward, his footsteps muffled by the thick silence of the tunnels. Then the whispers started. At first they were faint, just a murmur drifting through the corridors. But as he moved deeper, they grew clearer, fragmented voices speaking in hushed, hurried tones. The sound was all around him. Above, below, beside him, whispers of those long gone. Ethan's pulse quickened. He raised his flashlight and caught glimpses of the tunnel's walls, carvings, symbols etched into the stone, depicting human figures twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. And then, at the tunnel's end, he saw them. Shadow-like figures writhed against the walls, their forms barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. They moved unnaturally, their elongated fingers stretching toward him, their bodies twisting in silent torment. Their faces were obscured, featureless voids that seemed to suck in the surrounding light. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. He staggered back as one of the figures lurched toward him, its presence radiating an unnatural cold. The whispers turned into wails, a chorus of lost souls crying out, pleading, warning. You are not supposed to be here. The tunnel trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. The figures surged forward, and Ethan ran. Chapter 9. The Mark of the Taken. Ethan scrambled back, his pulse hammering. As he turned, he saw an old mirror covered in dust. Wiping it clean with trembling hands, he nearly screamed. His reflection was wrong. His eyes were darkened, the pupils unnaturally wide, almost consuming the irises entirely. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins faintly visible beneath the surface. But it wasn't just his appearance. His expression was hollow, vacant, devoid of life. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had seen this look before. In the missing townsfolk, in the shadows that moved through Hollow Creek. The mark of the taken was already upon him. His breath came in short gasps as he stumbled away from the mirror, shaking his head in disbelief. He grabbed his flashlight, fumbling to turn it back on. The light flickered, barely illuminating the space around him. The temperature dropped further, an icy wind curling through the cracks of the abandoned room. Then, the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't layered voices warning him to leave. This time, The voices were speaking directly to him. "You are one of us now." The whisper coiled around him like invisible tendrils, weaving into his thoughts. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as the words embedded themselves in his mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the voices away. But the sensation of something unseen closing in around him only grew stronger. He forced himself to look back at the mirror, his trembling hands gripping the edges of the frame. His reflection was still there, but it had changed. His lips moved, forming words, but he wasn't speaking. "It's too late." A shadow passed behind him in the glass, though when he spun around there was nothing. But the whispering continued, relentless. The mark had been placed. The hollow had chosen him. And now it was only a matter of time. Chapter 10: The Keeper of Hollow Creek. Just as Ethan tried to flee, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form unnaturally tall and shrouded in tattered robes. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its presence sucking the warmth from the air. The face beneath the hood was obscured by darkness, but its eyes, if they could be called that, were pits of swirling void, absorbing the dim light around them. A voice, layered and unnatural, resonated through the air. "You have seen too much," it whispered, the words slithering into Ethan's mind rather than his ears. "Now, you belong to the hollow." Ethan staggered backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He willed his legs to move, but the ground beneath him felt heavier, as if unseen hands were anchoring him in place. The mist around him thickened, swirling like living tendrils, wrapping around his arms, his torso, his throat. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the suffocating darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips, only silence, as if the very air had been stolen from his lungs. His flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the ruined buildings. The world around him twisted and distorted, the buildings warping into unrecognizable shapes. The figure in the hood raised an elongated hand, fingers too long, too thin, curling as if pulling invisible strings. Ethan's body convulsed, an unbearable weight pressing into his chest. He gasped, his vision swimming, his strength draining away. The town demanded a soul. He realized with a sickening certainty that it had chosen him. Chapter 11: The Escape That Wasn't. Ethan sprinted through the desolate streets of Hollow Creek, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The mist had thickened, coiling around him like spectral fingers, distorting reality with every step. The whispers, once hushed and distant, now grew into ear-piercing shrieks, overlapping voices screaming in languages he could not understand. He didn't stop. He couldn't. His car was just beyond the town's entrance, parked exactly where he had left it. If he could just reach it, if he could just turn the key in the ignition, he could escape. The moment he burst through the fog, relief nearly choked him. His car was still there, covered in a fine layer of dust, its metallic frame untouched. Fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably, he yanked open the door and threw himself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life on the first try. He slammed his foot on the gas, Gravel kicked up behind the tires as he sped down the road, desperate to leave the cursed town behind. The trees on either side of the road blurred, the mist finally beginning to clear. He could almost taste freedom. But then something gnawed at him, a cold, creeping sensation crawling up his spine. Ethan hesitated before glancing in the rearview mirror, and that was when his heart stopped. Hollow Creek stretched endlessly behind him. The town's decrepit buildings, the looming church, the fog-soaked streets. They weren't fading into the distance. They weren't disappearing into the night. He was still there. The road he had driven on no longer stretched forward. It looped, twisting and bending impossibly, folding reality into itself. He had never left. Hollow Creek had trapped him. Chapter 12. The Final Entry. Ethan found himself back at the records office, his hands trembling as he pushed open the warped wooden door. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of decay clinging to the aged paper and forgotten artifacts of the town's past. Something was pulling him forward, an unseen force compelling him to the heavy wooden desk at the center of the room. His fingers hovered over the dust-covered surface before he reached out and brushed away the grime, revealing a single book lying beneath the filth. The town ledger. The letters were engraved into the leather-bound cover, worn from years of use. Or perhaps something far older. With an unsteady breath, Ethan opened it. The pages crackled beneath his touch, brittle, yet strangely untouched by time. He skimmed through the pages, his eyes scanning the neatly written names, hundreds of them. Families, children, generations of residents from long ago. But as he flipped forward, his blood ran cold. The ink changed. The older names were carefully penned in faded brown, but the later entries, more recent ones, were written in jagged, frantic strokes of deep black ink, and next to every name, a single word stood out. His pulse hammered in his ears. He kept turning the pages, each one feeling heavier than the last. His mind screamed for him to stop, to close the book, to leave while he still could. But then, on the very last page, he saw it. His own name, freshly written, and next to it in the same jagged handwriting, taken. A cold breath brushed against his neck. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The ledger's ink glistened as if freshly spilled, and the whispers that had followed him since his arrival now spoke with eerie clarity. You were never meant to leave. The pages fluttered wildly as if turned by unseen hands, the names blurred, shifting, reforming into something darker, something alive. Ethan staggered back, the book slamming shut on its own, and then the room fell silent. The last light from the setting sun filtered through the broken window, casting long, distorted shadows. Ethan turned to run, but as he did, the reflection in the cracked glass caught his eye. It wasn't his own. Chapter 13. The Hollow Beckons. The town no longer felt abandoned. The air pulsed with movement, unseen figures shifting just beyond the edges of his vision. Shadows flickered through the mist. Footsteps echoed in every direction. The whispers no longer warned. They welcomed him. their voices weaving through the air like a chant, a summons he could not ignore. And then he saw them. Emerging from the fog, the missing townsfolk stood in eerie silence. Their faces were obscured, shrouded in darkness, their features twisted into hollow, unreadable expressions. Their presence was unnatural, their movements slow but deliberate. They did not walk, they drifted forward, their limbs moving as though suspended in water. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. He stumbled backward, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline, but the beam flickered, failing against the encroaching figures. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The fog thickened around him, coiling like unseen hands. The nearest figure lifted an arm, pointing directly at him. The others followed. A chorus of whispers surged through the air, merging into a single chilling phrase. "Join us." A force stronger than fear gripped Ethan's chest. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out all thought. The figures stepped closer, their shapes twisting, their hollow eyes burning into him. His mind screamed for escape, but there was none. The hollow had claimed him, and in that moment he understood. He had never been a visitor. He had been expected. He had been chosen. The darkness surged forward, swallowing him whole. Chapter 14. The last light fades. Ethan fought against the force, pulling him into the abyss, but it was like struggling against an invisible tide. The darkness crept around him, thick and suffocating, pressing against his skin like something alive. His flashlight flickered, its beams sputtering as if it too was being drained by the overwhelming void. He stumbled forward, reaching for anything solid, something to anchor himself. But the town around him was no longer what it had been. The streets twisted and blurred, warping into an endless maze of shadows. The buildings, once broken and abandoned, seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, their outlines stretching unnaturally tall toward him as if watching. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a low guttural hum reverberating through the air, like the town itself was breathing. And then Ethan saw it. His own reflection in a shattered window pane. But it wasn't him. Not entirely. His hollow eyes stared back at him, wide and lifeless, the pupils swallowed by an unnatural darkness. His skin looked almost translucent, stretched thin over his features, as though he were already fading. He reached up, pressing a trembling hand against his face, but his reflection did not move in sync. It smirked. A cold dread gripped him. He tried to step away, but his body refused to obey. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear, yet somehow he understood them all the same. "You are one of us now." The last flicker of his flashlight died. The window shattered, and Ethan Carter was no more. Chapter 15. Another traveler arrives. Days later, a young woman named Claire arrived in Hollow Creek, drawn by the same mystery that had lured Ethan. The town's eerie silence was suffocating, its streets seemingly frozen in time. As she cautiously made her way through the mist-laden town, something caught her eye. A worn leather-bound journal resting on the doorstep of the abandoned records office. Kneeling, she picked it up, its cover damp from the ever-present fog. The book lay open to a single page, the ink disturbingly fresh, as if written mere moments ago. Her fingers trembled as she read the words scrawled in jagged, urgent handwriting. The curse is real. The shadows come at night. They take us one by one. If you are reading this, run. Claire's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but before she could act, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the abandoned buildings, carrying a sound that sent chills down her spine. A whisper, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but then it grew clearer, unmistakable. Her name. Claire. Her pulse quickened, panic seizing her chest. The fog around her thickened, swirling unnaturally, coiling like ghostly tendrils reaching for her. The town was waking. It had found its next traveler. And just like Ethan before her, she was already too late.